With the resources of the Len and Erika Staerk Media Center, the Lebanon Historical Society is proud to make this video available to our members and friends. We appreciate your support. Before the days of perpetual care at Lebanon's cemeteries, it was expected that the families of the deceased would care for the graves. That meant mowing the grass and tending plants on one or more grave sites, and sometimes at multiple cemeteries. While the mowing began early in April, the annual highlight was Decoration Day, May 30th, when small crowds of people would congregate at Lebanon's cemeteries to plant flowers, trim shrubs, tidy up the headstones, and make a special visit to the graves of veterans. Immediately following the Civil War, it was determined there needed to be a day to memorialize those veterans who had given their lives. The official declaration stated, "The 30th of May, 1868, is designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country during the late rebellion." The date and the name Decoration Day stuck, and it would be called Decoration Day for nearly a century. The date was chosen because no Civil War battle had been fought on May 30th. After World War I, Decoration Day was declared a day to honor those who died in active service in all of our nation's conflicts. Veterans Day on November 11th was established to celebrate all veterans, living and dead. In 1971, Congress declared Memorial Day to be celebrated the last Monday in May. Decoration Day in Lebanon became a kind of mini family reunion, as multiple generations and diverse branches of a family congregated on Lebanon's cemeteries. First and foremost, it was a work day. Grave sites needed to be mowed. While cemeteries provided old-fashioned reel-type push mowers, they were usually dull and rusty. So most families loaded their power mower into the trunk of the car or the bed of the pickup, where the mower would be joined with flats of pansies, petunias, salvia, and geraniums. Like so many things in Lebanon, decorating graves became a competition. Which family could boast the best tended family plots? After Decoration Day, gossip was rampant. Until the 1960s, planter boxes made of stone or concrete or out of granite from the gravestones were common on older graves. There wasn't enough room to use a power mower effectively. As a result, much time was spent on hands and knees using hand clippers to achieve the best trimmed effect. The planter boxes did provide up to 32 square feet of planting space. After the planter boxes were removed, annuals, perennials, rose bushes, and even evergreen shrubs would be nestled against headstones. Grandpa Edward Werth had a fondness for the rare Russian fern leaf peony. It thrived on Grandma and Grandpa's grave for years, until a collector of specimen plants made off with it by dark of night. Elaborate displays of annuals required weekly weeding, and if the weather didn't cooperate, regular watering. Jugs of water were hauled to the various cemeteries to refresh all those tender plants. For both my parents, Edgar Werth and Elsie née Schoeneke Werth, tending the family plots at St. Peter's Cemetery was an obsession. Since we only lived about 100 yards from the cemetery driveway, tending the graves of ancestors from all branches of the family tree became our responsibility. 20 of my closest ancestors are buried on the St. Peter's Cemetery in New Lebanon. 13 are buried on the consolidated Old Lebanon Cemetery. 2 great-grandparents are buried on the Lehman Cemetery in Hustisford, and 2 second great-grandparents are buried on the consolidated Lutheran Cemetery in Watertown. Decoration Day would find Mom, Dad, and me out mowing, trimming, tilling soil, and planting dozens of diverse annuals on more than a dozen grave sites. Equipped with power mower, garden tools, and a dozen jugs of water, we would spend the better part of the day decorating. I am the 5th generation of my family born in America. 37 of my 62 direct ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents through 4th great-grandparents, are all buried within 10 miles or less of the village of Lebanon. The other 25 are buried in various parts of Germany. By my reckoning, there are nearly 100 blood relatives of mine buried at the St. Peter's Cemetery, and another 200 or more buried on the other Lebanon cemeteries. Take a moment to think about that. For 4 generations, the world of my immediate family was limited to the Lebanon area. My favorite part of Decoration Day came when all the chores were finished and my father and I would stroll around at least 5 Lebanon cemeteries. Dad would regale me with stories about my grandparents, great-grandparents, second great-grandparents, great-uncles and great-aunts, second and third cousins once and twice removed. Naturally, we would encounter aunts and uncles and dozens of cousins along the way as they too strolled the cemeteries of Lebanon. Decoration Day was quite like a roving family reunion. I suppose it was almost inevitable that years before I was born, even years before my parents were married, all 8 of my great-grandparents would be buried within yards of each other on the St. Peter's Cemetery. 6 of them are buried in a cluster right next to each other. The other 2 are buried 27 feet from that cluster of 6. While it was coincidental, it certainly made mowing and flower bed tending much easier. The Old Lebanon Consolidated Cemetery is the final place for hundreds more of my blood relations. My Brosh ancestors are buried on the Lebanon Baptist Cemetery. Some of my Schoeneke ancestors rest on the Pankow Cemetery, the St. Paul's Old Lebanon, not to be confused with St. Paul's Sugar Island. There are Uteks, Kahlers, Mengerts, and Schulzes buried on Wanderers Rest Cemetery, which was begun as the cemetery for St. Matthew's of Old Lebanon, a church that also no longer exists. And there are many Uteks buried on the Emmanuel Cemetery. Our stroll would usually begin on the Pankow Cemetery at the north end of the Consolidated Old Lebanon Cemeteries. That was the cemetery for the old St. Paul's of Old Lebanon, which no longer exists. Moving south, we arrived at the mass grave that rests on Emmanuel Cemetery, where the 21 victims of the 1854 cholera epidemic are interred. No funerals were held for these victims. They were buried immediately. Their bodies were covered with quicklime and then a layer of soil. The mass grave would remain open until the deaths ceased. August Herman Utek, my second great uncle, died in infancy and is buried in the mass grave. Then we moved to the site where 5 children of my second great-grandparents, Karl Friedrich Utek and Friederika Wilhelmina Louisa née Kahler Utek, are buried. She birthed 16 children between 1852 and 1883. 8 lived to marry and have children. Among them, my great-grandfather, Friedrich Karl Johann Hermann Utek. 5 of their children died within 12 days between March 27th and April 8th, 1882. All succumbed to diphtheria. They ranged in age from 5 to 17. All are buried side by side. The second of the stones is beyond recognition. The parents are buried at St. Peter's. There would be one final stop on our Decoration Day cemetery tour, and that was St. John's St. Mark's Sugar Island Cemetery. Some of my Schenectady and Brosh ancestors participated in the founding of St. John's Lutheran Church, Sugar Island, in the 1850s. They had been members of Emmanuel Old Lebanon, but the constant flooding of the Rock River and the Great Marsh made it impossible to get to church without a rowboat for much of the year. The Sugar Islanders established a daughter church of Emmanuel Lutheran Church and named it St. John's. St. John's Ashepan is a direct descendant of that parish. The pastor lived on the Sugar Island. The church stood at the spot where a grove of trees is planted on the cemetery today. St. John's closed in 1906. When St. Mark's in Sugar Island was established in 1913, St. Mark's took over the cemetery and renamed it St. Mark's Cemetery. Well, that's how I observed Decoration Day in Lebanon in my youth. It was a good tradition that reinforced patriotic pride and certainly developed in me a sense of responsibility to those of our family who had gone before us. Since some of my wife Ruth's Tessman and Andre forebears are buried at St. Peter's, to this day you're likely to find us meandering around the various cemeteries in Lebanon, paying our respects. Some traditions are hard to break. Our annual pilgrimages continue to be a trip down amnesia lane for both of us.